Hello and good morning from my side. My name is Linda Gale. I'm an exhibition curator here at the museum, and I have the honor and also the duty to do the first session of the day. So it's a big pressure on me. If we lose you, it's all my fault. Thank you. But what are we actually going to talk about in this session? We want to talk about the power of objects in storytelling. So I personally believe that objects are the superpower we as museums have. Our objects touch people, they can tell stories, and they can trigger a reflection. But how can we use this power to engage the public with our topics, and how many different stories can we potentially tell with just one object? And can they help us also to build bridges to new audiences? So for this session, we invited 3 museum people that we think are doing inspiring work in their fields, and speakers who represent different museums and different collections. Their challenge was to choose one object from their collection and use this object to illustrate their approach or perspective on this topic. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the inputs in a minute, and I hope they also made it over to this session, but I see, yes, they are around. Just before I give a short introduction, one quick practical note. So if you have a question or a remark during the session, that's super great. Just keep that in mind. We will have some time, hopefully at the end of the session, to bring you up here on the digital stage, so you can ask your questions, and we can hopefully discuss about this topic together with our panelists. So we will use the raise your hand button for that, and come to that after the presentations. So having said that, I would like to invite our speakers to the stage. I see they're all here. Hi, great to see you again.
Hello, morning.
Good morning to everyone. So let me quickly introduce who we have here in our first session. It's Basil Thüring. I see him next to me on this side. Hi, Basil. Basil is co-director of the Natural History Museum in Basel in Switzerland. He works for 20 years in museums and for 17 years at the museum in Basel, where he spearheaded multiple temporary and permanent exhibition projects. One is about to open this week, so we are in particular happy that you joined us today. But there are even bigger adventures ahead. So Basil and his team will build a completely new museum in the next 8 years, where they will have a strong focus on opening up their collections to the public. And we hope that we will hear a little bit about that and get some insights from their approach today. Then we're happy to have Ken Arnold with us. He is director of the Medical Museum in Copenhagen and professor at the Copenhagen University and creative director at the Wellcome Trust, where he had spearheaded a number of multidisciplinary initiatives that led to the establishment of the Wellcome Collection in London in 2007, where Ken directed the first 10 years of programming. And today he oversees transdisciplinary research initiative and international projects focused on culturally inspired public engagement with medicine and well-being. And he regularly writes and lectures about the past and present of museum cultures, and is currently also researching a book about the enduring significance of England's earliest museums. Welcome, Ken. And last but not least, I'm happy to have Léontine Meijer-van Mensch with us today. She is the director of the State Ethnographical Collections of Saxony, that includes the Ethnographical Museums of Dresden, Leipzig, and Herrnhut. And previously, she was the program manager of the Jewish Museum in Berlin and deputy director of the Museum of European Cultures in Berlin. She's an internationally active expert on holistic approaches to contemporary museum theory and practice. And she also writes and lectures regularly and focuses her work on research on participatory strategies and a stronger social role of museums. So I'm very glad to have all of you here today for this first session. And now I would like to pass the mic to Basil, who will be the first presenter in our session today, and everyone else, see you later.
Good morning. I tried to put on my show. So I hope this works. Good morning, everybody. My duty is today to breaking the ice in the morning. Instead of having a beer, we are having a coffee. So good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing fine. I just have to fix something. And yes, as Linda mentioned, I'm sitting here in Switzerland. Switzerland is at the north of Europe or the Central Europe. And Basel is sitting at the very north of Switzerland, close to the border to Germany and France. So it's a beautiful tri-border region with a lot of connections to France and Germany. I work at the beautiful Natural History Museum in Basel, which is a classical natural science museum. We are financed by the Canton Basel-Stadt, and we have an old tradition. We are looking back, dating back to the 16th century, and we were founded 1821 officially. So next year we're celebrating the 200 years anniversary. Currently, we are housed in a classicistic museum building from 1849 in the medieval part of the old city of Basel. Today, we keep over 11 million of objects. We call this the collection of archives of life. So we draw knowledge from these objects, these important regional and international collections, and pass it to the public. That's our mission. We do this on one hand through classical exhibitions and school programs for young people and small people, and on the other hand through public guided tours and events of different kinds. On the other hand, the worldwide network enables us to engage in a comprehensive exchange of knowledge, which guarantees research and communication at a very high level. But straight of our objects and our scientific components, we do research and we're telling stories. That's why I believe in the story and in the power of objects and the power of facts, power of science and the power of storytelling. So I think today I start with a story of a finger, a story of, we tell about object. This is like this, it's an object. This is, it's a finger. It's a real finger. It's the pointing finger of Johannes Widmer. Johannes Widmer, that's Johannes. I'm sorry, that's the only picture I have. I do not have a better picture. Johannes was a stonemason. He was born 1818 in Germany, Mülheim, in southern Germany, and he died in 1853 in Basel. So probably after a heavy war injury or perhaps on tuberculosis. We don't know really. So he died in a public hospital in Basel, and he was buried at the so-called Spitalfriedhof St. Johann. It's like the hospital had his own cemetery. And in the 80s, a public park was planned. So the cemetery had to be excavated. That's why it's written 1881 on the label here. Finally, the bones, especially the finger, ended in our collection, and a beautiful park was opened, how it looks today. But let's get back to Johannes. But why do I tell you this story? Because the life and the human remains of Johannes and his grave neighbors, they provide important scientific insights, and they are part of different stories. And we were very lucky. Why? During the excavation the archaeologists found over 1,000 skeletons of this public cemetery. And they also found in the public archive all the medical records of the hospital. So there was several books, and we had a funeral plan. This is a funeral plan, so the specialist could match all the skeletons with the plan and the medical records. This is very rare that you have 1,000 people which lived in the beginning of the 19th century, and to have all the story of it. This is really on the global side, it's very rare. And there's a huge source of information. The medical record, several books with files of every problem, of every person. But we had a problem. As you can see, the writing is very difficult. It's written in an old German writing, the so-called Kurrentschrift, which is not easy to read. I can't read it. So you need special knowledge or you need to be very old, and because at school you learned that 80 years ago. Therefore, we started a large citizen science project for the translation and digitalization of the records, and also for the historic and genealogical research. So over 100 people were working in the state archive or in our collection to get known of all these data. And these files are very important because they're documenting the last hours, days and weeks in the hospital, the story of the death, the diagnosis, but also providing personal data like the age, the profession, the personal situation, the social status, and so on. So it's really a rich source. And at the end, the thousands of skeletons were identified. So we know every fate, and we know a lot of more. We're getting a very deep insight in the social situation of the society of a city in the 19th century. But the insight is because it was a public hospital of the poor people. We have a big insight in normal people, which is very rare from all the time, because normal rich people, they are documented, and the poor people, they are not. For example, we have the detailed description of the first successful cesarean section in Basel. But now let's get back to the finger of Johannes. So it's the left-hand pointing finger, and the theory of the skeleton of the Spitalfriedhof, which is the official name, getting known in the scientific community. So a few years ago, a team of anthropologists of Thüringen came to Basel to study the hands and the finger of the skeletons. They wanted to find out if the profession of a person is marked on the bone, if there's different shapes of the muscles show on this bone. So they were able to develop a new method and classify finger dexterity based on the muscle attachment site. So the idea was to answer the following question. You show me your finger and I tell you your profession. It's a really easy one. So, that was too quick. But this is not only interesting for forensic investigations, but also they wanted to know more. So they applied the method to the Neanderthals. So what was the profession of the Neanderthals? But how do they work? So they scanned different skeletons and they made a principal concept analysis to classify the size of the muscle attachment marks and to make a method. And so how were the finger abilities of the Neanderthal? So they could match it and they can show. So in the paper of Kostis et al., they published in 2018, they could prove the evidence for precision grasping. That means they could hold the finger, so they could hold, not like a primitive hominid, they could really have fine abilities to hold things. So they had the similar finger abilities like modern humans. So we have a little bit to forget this picture that Neanderthals were not club-wheeled primitive hominids. No, they had amazing abilities and could work with fingers. So this picture we should definitely forget. So almost 200 years of his life, Johannes has told an amazing story, and an unimposing skeleton becomes an important tool for science. This was one of 1,000 stories of our collection. So I'm wondering what else is lying in our collection, which story we should tell, which story we should discover, and perhaps which story lies in my finger. You never know. So what's our next story? The next story museum. So we're working, as Linda mentioned, on a really big story. The story is lying here. So it's not another finger or another cemetery. No, it's a future construction field. Here lies the future of our museum. In a few months, probably in March, we start with the construction of the new museum, a completely new museum, which will open in 2028. Here you can see visualization. But our question the last 10 years was to ask, what is a museum in 28? What is a museum in 38? What is a museum in 48? How do you plan the future of a museum? So we tried to go in new ways. So the idea of our museum is a bit different. So today, people look, like the audience look, museum is like the exhibition. They don't know this, they're a collection, nothing. So the actual museum is like the collection, which is the exhibition, which is pink, it's separate completely from the collection. You can't see public scientific work, you can't see people, you can see the process of scientific work, you can't see the objects. So we want to change that, because this is not only the tip of the iceberg, the exhibitions. We would like also to destroy the ivory tower where the scientific people are living in there. So the initial concept was a completely mixture between collection and exhibition. So we are going new ways. We are mixing, and the public should see and visit the collection. They should see the people, they should see the working people in the labs and the collection. And they also should use the collection. So the cross section of the building is quite big, it's like a shelf. You can see in the very heart of the museum, all the collections. And at the border, you can see the exhibition rooms and people, like they're walking through the exhibition to the next exhibition, to the collection, to the next exhibition, going backwards, and like meandering through the whole building. And on the visualization, between the exhibition halls, you have like these tunnels, these small exhibition halls where you can see inside the exhibition, inside the collection, the authentic collection, the real collection. Suddenly the collection will be a part of the museum, a part of the museum tour. They will feel diversity of, in our case, of nature, the diversity of collection, because 11 million of objects is quite a lot. And they will see the strength and the power of the collection. They see that people are working there. They see the process, they see into the labs, into the other labs. And so as we think so many stories could be told, and the museum getting a more public and open space. So that will be our future. So that was my speech. I thank you for the attention. So thank you.
Thank you, Basil, for this interesting talk and insight, and for telling us the story about Johannes that also tells a story about ourselves and about our collections. Thank you. Yes, I would like to ask Ken now to share his thoughts on objects and storytelling with us. Hi, Ken.
Hello. How nice to be with you. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. And yeah, I was just thinking as Basil was talking there are lots of parallels, I think, in our talk. So I'm going to ask us to move from a finger to a bottle. And I want to talk about storytelling around one particular object at Medical Museum. And I guess my talk is a little bit about trying to work out what this bottle is full of. And another thought I had as Basil was talking there, which I think is kind of parallel to what he says. I mean, this is almost a spoiler alert going back to the title of the conference itself, but maybe sometimes new ways for us are about re-looking at old ways and thinking about how to make them relevant in new contexts. So let me start actually somewhere else. So I'm not going to talk about this, but I just wanted to share where I am and what I do when I'm not in Copenhagen at the Medical Museum. And I work in an organization called Welcome, which I hope some of you know. And my role there is to oversee a transdisciplinary research center, and then to also head up some international cultural engagement projects, exhibitions, presentations, events in different parts of the world around big topics that are of interest to Welcome. The last one we did was Contagious Cities. Ironically, we finished it just a few months before the whole world was engulfed in a new contagious outbreak. And fantastically, part of the project landed at the Museum for Naturkunde in Berlin. It was wonderful to work with so many of the people organizing today's conference, today and tomorrow's conference, and working on a project called Coexistence. But this is the focus of my attention today. So here is Medical Museum. And yeah, usually when I give public talks and I talk about it, I'm interested to know how many people have been there. So there's no way of finding that out, but I implore you, when we're allowed to travel again, please do come and visit us in Copenhagen. It's a wonderful treasure of a museum, and we would love to welcome you there. Okay, so Medical Museum is a museum for the culture and the history of medicine. So we're interested in linking science and humanities and arts perspectives around exploring different parts of medical culture. But we're also a research department focused on medical humanities with PhDs, postdocs, professors. And I guess at the core of our work is an idea of a virtuous circle. So in some ways we do research to make our cultural program richer, more experimental. And we do that public programming, those exhibitions, those events, in order to make our research more relevant, more tangible. And then one particular room we draw great inspiration from. So this is the auditorium for teaching anatomy and surgery initially. It was set up in 1787. And in some ways you could say this is where the modern teaching of scientific medicine began in Denmark. So at the visual focus, so right here in this slide, is where in the 18th century it was an unusual, exciting idea that you bring in real bodies, that you'd have authentic evidence from the physical world, and that you'd learn from that. But I think it's always worth remembering that this is a space that's mostly called an auditorium. So this is as much a space about the ears as it is about the eyes. This is a place to learn from other people's expertise. And therefore, this space is all about hearing and listening, and all about looking at objects. And I suppose that's, I think, at the core of this session of the conference. So I want to hold on to those two key ideas brought together in this room. And here is my object. A small, unassuming looking flask. It's about 20 centimeters tall, maybe. And it's filled with a milky liquid. And on the side of the glass is a handwritten label in Swedish, which says that this contains gut excretion from a patient in the cholera outbreak in October 1853. And then actually just along the side of it, just here, there is a further inscription that tells us that the patient survived, or at least survived this medical episode. The content is sometimes called rice water, but to be very honest and rather direct, and apologies just after breakfast maybe, but this really is shitty water. Okay, one other thing that I want to draw your attention to in this bottle, and that's here in the glass. You can see where the glass has been resealed. So a test tube was melted and put on top of the flask, and therefore the contents have been completely sealed ever since. As far as we know, there's no other object, certainly in any museum we know of out there in the world. It'd be fantastic after this conference if someone came and told me that there is another one they know of. But as a consequence of all this, we think this might be one of the oldest samples of cholera bacteria. Slightly frighteningly, we think it could even be alive, although that's very unlikely. But if nothing else, this definitely represents a sort of frozen moment in a disease history. And then just as an aside, a colleague of mine, Adam Bernkardt, pointed out this sort of ticklish comparison with another famous container of feces. So as many of you probably know, this is an object called artist shit. It's by the artist Piero Manzoni. And he put about 30 grams each of his own feces into 90 tins, reportedly. And I suppose, you know, in a fascinating way, this is very similar in content. It's very similar in form and substance. But of course, these two objects couldn't be more different in meaning or intention or histories, or indeed the types of museums they've ended up with. That could be the start of a whole other talk, but I'll glide on to showing you how we currently display our own bottle. So here it is on show in one of our rooms in Medical Museum. It's in a gallery called Balance and Metabolism. And in this room, we're exploring the early idea, the classical idea of four humors, so blood, phlegm, yellow and black bile. And this, of course, was the dominant medical idea for many centuries, for 1,000 years almost, up until modern times. And here, in museological terms, our object is maybe one of 100 on display, and it's part of a bigger narrative. I'm never sure whether exhibitions tell stories. Objects, I think, do tell stories. But anyway, maybe it's more part of an analysis here, but it is an ingredient in this, this exhibition narrative that we lay out. And therefore, the object is part of a bigger story. By contrast, I wanted to show you this. This is another exhibition with mini objects. This is an installation by the Chinese artist Song Dong, and it's called Waste Not. And in this installation, he pulled together some 10,000 ordinary objects that were actually collected by his mother during a half century or so of her life. And while I was there, I saw it in London. This image is from New York. I started thinking about how long you would look in this exhibition if you looked at every single object for 1 second. And I worked out that it was about 3 hours of visit. And of course, that was never what was intended. But I think it does, going to this exhibition and even looking at this picture, does make you begin to reflect about a world of too much, a world where we're tied into the bombardment of things and the bombardment of objects. I read somewhere that more than 1 trillion images were taken with mobile phones in 2017. But I guess at the core of museums is the idea that we can reduce our exposure to too many things, to too much, that it has the power, it's almost the technology of slowing us down and getting us to focus maybe sometimes on just one individual object. One of the much quoted bits of research in museums has ended up suggesting that on average, people maybe take some 17 seconds to look at an individual work and indeed read the label. So I thought it might be interesting this morning just to see what looking at this object for 17 seconds feels like. So I'm going to not talk for 17 seconds. Okay, just to assure you that Zoom hasn't stopped working for me. So I wonder what people were thinking about as they looked at that. Were they wondering how it was made, by whom? Were they wondering about the different experiences that the person who made it and the person whose stomach contents are in the bottle, their different lives, their different feelings? Maybe people were thinking about their own disease experiences. Of course, that's very much on all of our minds at the moment. Or maybe, you know, why do museums keep these things and what should they do with them? So I suppose all of that, I think, begins to suggest that not only is this a bottle full of the contents of somebody's stomach, but it's also a bottle full of questions, a bottle full of intrigue, a bottle full of research potential. And that's certainly something that we're keen to develop at Medical Museum. So we've begun to tease out 3 different ways in which we could put this object at the center of a research project. Research into the history of the object, into the biology and the epidemiology that it contains, and then leaping out from the bottle into an anthropology of contemporary medicine and health, and indeed into health equity in different parts of the world. So in terms of history, we could go back to this bottle and think about what the doctor and others like him were thinking about at the time. This is pre-germ theory. So why were they interested in capturing this material and putting it into a bottle? And then we know from statistics at the time that this was one of the last times that cholera visited Denmark and Copenhagen. Some 5,000 people died, but it was also the start of new public health measures. And this bottle could lead us into historical and contemporary understandings of those measures. And then in terms of the bottle and the contents of the bottle itself, any number of new microbiological and epidemiological techniques, ideas could be applied to the study of the context so that we could end up with a much richer phylogenetic insight into what was then the 3rd cholera pandemic and compare it, interestingly, to what's going on today in what scientists call the 7th cholera pandemic. And then it would also be possible probably to get hold of the phages from the contents of the bottle and indeed the microbiome of the patient, and then further afield to reflect on historic and contemporary public health measures. But just to pause and say that I'm getting ahead of myself, because of course that opens up a question of how do we get into this bottle? And if we want to do that scientific study, we'd have to break it. And that of course opens up a whole series of other museological questions about how do you balance the heritage value of an object like this against its scientific value of discovering its contents. And then the final context is with cholera today. So Copenhagen University already has a number of anthropology-led studies of disease in Bangladesh. We would use this project to link up with them and then to open up some rather big questions. So shockingly, of course, despite possible prevention and indeed cure of cholera, there are estimates that somewhere like 2.8 million cases a year affect people in different parts of the world, and that cholera takes around about 140,000 deaths a year. This bottle could allow us to explore those deeply troubling statistics and to lend weight to campaigns to try and change all of that. Okay, it's time for me to close up. So I want to go back to my humble bottle in conclusion. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is I think it's a special power of museums and particular objects in them, like Basil's finger maybe, to go back and to use objects as a source of research, to tease out new areas of knowledge. And then using the other aspect of museums to turn to contexts, to turn to ways in which we tell stories about them. I've shown you that this bottle is currently in one particular story about ancient ideas to do with medical philosophy. We're contemplating using it next year in a contemporary art exhibition we're mounting at a contemporary art space in Copenhagen, in an exhibition called The World is in You, where it will be shown in a very different context alongside the work of contemporary artists. And then we might also use it in an exhibition we're planning very early next year, a show which will open on the 1-year anniversary of the first lockdown in Denmark, a show called One Day Corona Will Be History Too. So there again, it will be an object telling a very different story. And I suppose to share with you my ambition for this object, one idea I would like to develop in the longer future is to have this at the center of a one object exhibition where all of that knowledge can be brought together around this one object so that we can give this object the opportunity to tell many, many different stories at the same time. Okay, it's time for me to close, but thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to the conversation and the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. What an interesting story. And yes, I also like the idea to have an exhibition on just one object and all the multiple stories we can tell with one object. Thank you. So our next speaker is Léontine. Léontine, are you with us?
I'm nice with you. And thank you both for your inspiring talks. I will try to give my to show my PowerPoint to you all. So today I would indeed like to talk about one object. One object, the so-called Damascus room, which is now in the Ethnographical Museum in Dresden, in the Japanese palace. And with this object, I would like to take you with me in my line of thought and go and dive a bit, hopefully, in material culture studies, and with a model which is called the object as data carrier. I would like to walk with you through my own lines of thoughts, and hopefully it serves as a possible tool for you as well, because I use this model a lot when I think about objects as data carriers, objects as storytellers, objects in all kinds of museological contexts, because I'm now working and being in an ethnographical context. Before that, I was in a Jewish museological context. And I like it that more and more these classifications between those museum traditions are becoming more and more fluid. One or two sentences about the object itself, because the point I'm trying to make today is that I'm using now this one object, but it could be another object as well. This is a so-called reception room from the old city of Damascus, probably 1810, 1811, made these wonderful reception rooms, played a huge role in visiting and hospitality culture in Damascus and in Syria in general. And this object came to the Ethnographical Museum in Dresden in the 1930s, survived the war, and is being rediscovered, or was rediscovered 70 years later. And since 20 years, colleagues of mine are restoring this object. A reception room in the city, or from the city of Damascus, now being in Dresden, is of course very interesting from a storytelling perspective, because there are hardly any reception rooms anymore left in Damascus because of the war. So an original Damascus room is now in Dresden, where contemporary people of living in Dresden, coming from Damascus themselves, have a place of home feeling, sense of belonging in this room, maybe. And as you probably know, Dresden has some issues when it comes to populism and right-wing anxieties, and therefore this Damascus room can be something else altogether. But coming back to the model, there's always an idea, right, in an object, and I call it myself the intangible part of every object. And for this object, we need matter, and this both makes an artifact. And when this artifact is being made, we have this factual identity. It's of course more a theoretical concept, because once the object is there, it gets a whole biography. It gets a lifeline. And looking at that lifeline, I think you can look at it from three perspectives, or even more, but at least this model is looking at the object from three perspectives. Its physical properties, and one came already in one of the talks. Now, the physical, the finger is a beautiful example, I think, of a physical property that is that you can archaeologically go back in time to look at the object as data carrier from this physicality, function and significance, and context, and that changes and develops over time. All those three, as I told you just now, they make up this actual identity, or how I like to call it, the biography of the object. Going back to the physical properties of the Damascus room, the Damascus room in itself has this very interesting story of being 70 years hidden in the cellar of the museum, surviving the Dresdner bombing, for example. And now colleagues of mine are renovating this Damascus room already for 20 years. But going back to the ethnological object per se, it's also a physicality that is hidden in there, that is longing to be discovered, sometimes by source communities, because there's so much knowledge and epistemic wisdom in this physical properties that is, for example, of very great importance for communities, for very great importance to maybe also tackle moments in our near future. So what, and we're now working on a project within our museum context, what can some Aboriginal objects tell us about former strategies of Aboriginal communities dealing with wildfires? And how in a museum context you can excavate this knowledge to make it accessible for the community in itself as an identity developer, but also to have strategies for our future. And then you come to this second part of this actual identity, this object as data carrier, this function and significance. That function and significance is something that is in this object before it became a museological object, of course, but also afterwards. And in the case of the Damascus room, it is, of course, very interesting that now this Damascus room in the city of Dresden is a space of welcoming and gathering as well, as it was in the 19th and earlier 20th century in Damascus. So here you see that function maybe has changed because it's now a museum object, but still you can, as a museum professional, also go back to this earlier function, or at least we tried to do that. And what I said already earlier as well is that the significance of this Damascus room as one of the few Damascus rooms that survived the war increased, of course, enormously the significance of this object. That there's one Aleppo room in the Museum of Islam Art in Berlin, there's one in New York, and there's one in Dresden. And the whole city of Damascus is bombarded and well, not there anymore. So looking, if you tell a story, looking more strongly towards the function and significance also in the space of time, I feel is for me at least very inspirational. And basically what I have been talking about till now is very much putting this one object, but in general ethnographical collections and in general objects per se, so much more in context. And that's what my speakers did, of course, as well. And when we talk about the context of objects, then of course this story pops up with, or the narrative pops up, is who is telling the story, who is telling the context, who is allowed to tell the context of a story in its also in its changing moments in time in the museum. And there I think we are still too much talking from a museum professional expertise. May it be the scientist in the museum, may it be the curator, may it be the educational officer, maybe be it something in between. But if we talk about the context of objects, especially in my ethnographical context, I think we have to open up those narratives and let that participatory moment come in, or at least opening up this narrative for much more and broader narratives. And then you come to something that I find extremely interesting. It's this polyphonic world, this polyphonic layer, which is in every object that we have in our collections. And that is, I think, for us difficult as museum people, but it is something that we do need to do, and not only front stage, but also very strongly backstage. And coming back to my object as data carrier, thinking and looking at those objects from a more material culture perspective, is what we are doing in the ethnographical, is embracing the intangible heritage of every object much more than we did before. And that means contextualizing it, as I said earlier, but also putting it much more stronger in a performative concept. Because that is an information layer that is, of course, most seldom not really opened up yet. And in an ethnological perspective, it is indeed very difficult, because most of our objects are so treated by poison that we can't put them in a performative context, because we are also in the whole context of restitution. What we are giving back most of the times would be objects that cause enormous difficult diseases, for example, cancer, because the objects are so poisonous. So how can you use this conceptual idea of the intangible object in a museum storytelling context without putting a screen next to your object that shows a little film of a performance or something else? I'm curious what my two fellow colleagues need to say about that, because for me, that is the most challenging aspect of storytelling in a museum context, especially the ethnographical. How can I embrace the intangible and show that intangibility? And how can I embrace and show that performativity? And intangibility and performativity are, of course, very close together. How can I do that without harming the object, of course, but also create safe environments for people who use the objects, and of course also in the context of putting them so in display that people can't take them with them in their pocket. Two sentences about the Damascus room. We are now in the last phase of restoring. In May, June, due to Corona, maybe a month later, we'll open. And we open indeed the exhibition with one object, the Damascus room. And it will not be a welcoming room, unfortunately, in Damascus anymore, but now it's a welcoming room in Dresden, where hopefully people with a Syrian background, but also other Dresdeners feel welcomed as the museum as a site of dialogue. Thank you so much.
thank you so much. Thank you so much for your input, Léontine. Thank all of the other speakers for your input. Maybe we can have everyone back on the stage. Great. I see you're joining me. Yes, thank you. Thank you for this. I would like, with a little, I have a look on the clock. We are on like 10 to 10. We will have probably a few minutes more for the discussion. So we will not end at 10 o'clock, but have maybe 5 to 10 minutes more. I would like to point out once more, whoever wants to ask a question or would like to contribute something to the discussion, please use the raise your hand button on your screen. Raise your hand. It looks like this. And then our team from the technical support can get you on the stage and we can see you and you can just ask your question personally. Unfortunately, I can't see if anyone is raising their hand. Ken is raising the hand. Great.
Yeah, it's a question to both Léontine and Basil. Thanks both for your fantastic talks. I was thinking, I mean, in different contexts about the word context. So in Basel, you showed us a beautiful but maybe difficult old building that you're moving out from, and then an architect's drawing of a new building, and then Léontine, you showed us the room within a room. And I always think one of the things that museums play with, and maybe sometimes are more conscious and less conscious of, is the power of the physical context, the room itself. And at Medical Museum in Copenhagen, we have a difficult 18th century building, but it feels, we always say, you know, it's our biggest object. It tells its own stories. And of course, it's a medical place and we're talking about medicine, so it helps us. But I just wonder what you think about, you know, we're very focused on objects here. Part of the context is the other objects that they sit next to, the context of who the people are and what they're thinking, but also the physical space. How big a role is that in your work as you think about you, Basil, helping create a new museum, and Léontine, the work you're doing with this room? How much does that help? How much does that hinder that we're asking people to come to a physical space?
Shall I start? That's a good question. We always thought about this question with the new museum, but I think it's, on the one hand, it's an advantage. On the other hand, it's a disadvantage. We have a very strong building. The museum was built for all the Museum of Basel, for the art museum, and also for the Ethnological Museum and for our museum. So it's very strong. So I think perhaps it's too strong. I think there's also a chance to museum. And as we do exhibitions in a really immersive way, so we have a strong scenography, so you can't see the room anymore. So I think we can deal with it. I think more it's like to lose the history, because if you come to our museum, you can feel and you can smell the history. You have the dust on the objects, and you're going to lose that. And and we have to deal with that, and to not to destroy all the history of the museum and the object. And we talk about with taking some objects. We have an old diorama of a cave bear made of plaster, which is very common, very famous by kids, to take the whole installation to the new museum and to put there as a installation. So that's the way we try to find a new way. But I think it's also the change because we have exhibitions from the 70s, from the 80s, and it's really, you can't show them anymore like this. And the rooms are so big, and we can't change anything because it's protected by the law. So I think this is a good chance, but we have to deal with it.
Thank you for your question, Ken. I'm a huge fan of Fred Wilson out of many reasons, but one thing he said was context is king, and the context, the museological context, is of course, I mean that changes every object, right? That's nothing new. And being in this context museum with others, it is this interactive experience that you have, that makes every room within the room, or every experience again also another experience, with again always other layers and other narratives. And I hope that museums can be more aware of that, and that this dialogical element, of this experience, because you are there with other people, is something that we need to think about much more when we think about our everything we do, may it programming or exhibition making, which is for me very much the same. But then we have to fundamentally switch our perspective from people who send because they want to send something, to people, to professionals who learn to listen much more to what our audience wants, and adapt according to that. And that's something where we unfortunately are not there yet. But if we can make a small contribution to that also by this whole conference, that would be wonderful. Because my talk was now very much talking from the object in itself as data carrier, looking at it from a museum perspective. But it could also be a totally different model with totally different outcomes when visitors or others, users, look at it. So food for thought there, Ken.
Thank you. I see we have already one person on the stage that has a question. It's Uwe. Hi, Uwe.
Hi. By coincidence, I have a question. After Ken's question and after the answers, I pull it a little bit back, but I really want to thank you. And it's astonishing how similar what you presented could have been a presentation about our approach of renewing our exhibitions. And you will get a sneak preview into that if you join our guided tour later. I was about to ask you what makes a great object, but you answered that basically already. But looking at the time, I would give space for other questions if they are, and if not, I am open. I will be at the Museum Concept Corner coffee break. So whoever from the participants wants to discuss what makes a great object is, welcomed to the coffee break, and I'm giving space to others here.
Thank you for this little hidden advertisement. But I heard that we have 3 more people that had raised their hands. So let's see who's coming up now. And yes, maybe in between, are you also joining the coffee breaks?
Of course, then we can open our gifts.
Great.
But I want to make a counter question out of it towards Udo and ask which object is not a beautiful storytelling object. I mean, every object has so much potential if we start to look at it from this polyphonic perspectives. I think every object has stories to tell and is potentially a wonderful museum object.
I want to hear from Sonu, so I'm going to be very brief, but just to make sure that not everyone agrees with everything, I'm going to disagree with you, Léontine. I think actually, one of the things about museums is they do anoint objects, they bless objects, and they say, not everything out there can have lots of stories told about it. I think that's, precisely our problem at the moment, is lots of things look as though they're just not interesting enough to tell stories about. And actually, I think if we're honest about it, lots of objects in our museums that we know next to nothing about are really poor storytellers, and that there's a slight myth that we get hooked up on, which is, each of you have thousands and probably millions of objects, and I don't think we can say every single one is a great storyteller. But I'll be deliberately provocative and shut up, and then we'll hear from someone.
Hello, everyone. I just want to give a big shout out to the team who organized this wonderful event. Hi from Sydney, from Australia. I'm a neurologist by profession, but a public health advocate, really very passionate about public health communication at this time. And that's why I really signed up for this wonderful event. My question to all the panelists would be that what role museums have in a public health crisis, such as COVID-19, where we are witnessing increasing social and justice divide in communities. We are seeing fragmenting communities. We are seeing more and more people from disadvantaged backgrounds suffering because of the health inequities, the systemic inequities that exist within the public health systems. And what role public health communicators, such as museums, can take to guide that thought leadership in that space. So really looking forward to that, your inputs on this. And thank you everyone for organizing this wonderful symposium.
Shall I say, yeah, so thank you for that question, Sonia. And I think it's, I work in a medical organization in London at Wellcome, and then I work for another medical organization at Medical Museum. So it's definitely something my colleagues and I have been thinking about. And I suppose my first part of the answer would be to just be humble. So, this is a subject on everybody's minds. I work at Wellcome in London. We're led by an epidemiologist who's frequently on the television and on the radio. And that area of expertise is, helping the world deal with this crisis and get out of it. And I have a slight feeling that we shouldn't overclaim what we can do in the cultural and museum sector. But on the other hand, I also think we do have a significant role. And I suppose for me, it's partly thinking about what is special about what we do. And I think in the name of cultural activity, one of the things that we can all do is think about, and I think it's brought out in the two talks this morning, is how museums can bring different people with different perspectives together. And I think Léontine makes a really important point about, who's been left out of the conversation. And we all have to say, people who've been in the world of museums for a long time, like me, have to just say we've got it wrong for a number of years or decades now. We've not been attentive enough to who else should be included. So I think we should be broad in who we try and get to come and join us in our conversations. And then I suppose the other thing I have a sense of is exactly our topic now, the value of objects and the value of things which look very old-fashioned and maybe slow us down, and that in the heat of the moment, we certainly need quick answers. We need lots of information. We need all the things that technology and the modern world is helping us provide to deal with this crisis. But we also need deep thought, and we need time to think, and we need time to have safe conversations where we don't all have the same opinion. And that, for me, is where museums can step up. Because I suppose one of the things that's become very clear to us, I think, is that the COVID crisis has reflected and maybe expanded any number of other crises that we've been living with, in terms of too much, in terms of arguably destroying our own world, in terms of being intolerant. And I think on those bigger questions, a cultural role for museums can really be to help us think deeply about some of those bigger questions, some of which may well have implicated us in terms of getting into the problems around COVID that we have already. But that would be my thought, and then start humble.
Are we still allowed to say something? Very short. First of all, I think museums have a role as a social space. We are in centers of cities. Why not open them as spaces? Maybe for schools. In Germany, there's now a huge discussion whether or not these huge spaces can be used as school spaces because the schools are too tight. Can it be safe spaces where people with experiencing violence at home can come, as safe space? Can it be something else? But we have this enormous trust, and we have these enormous spaces that are now in centers of cities, and it's so unused. That is for me, being a museum activist. And And again, it's asking asking as museums, hey society, how can we be of service now? So it's not again us sending, but it's us much more hearing what society needs. And that of course changes the role of us as museum professional. But I'm very intrigued by that, and I would like to explore more in that direction.
Thank you. So I think we have two more people. Maybe we do a quick one, and then I think we have to take some of the questions to the coffee break. It's Yuri Mateman from Naturalis.
Yes, I'm in there.
Hi, Yuri.
Hello. Yes, so my question is about authenticity of the objects. So we did some research on authenticity of objects together with the university, and one of the things is that people value authentic objects over replicas, etc. It's very interesting, but one of the things is something that you touch upon as well, and that's that the role of the story increases when appearances. The role of the story makes people value it more authentic. But the one thing I had, and we did this with our own T-Rex. So we dug up a T-Rex and we showed it, and it's its own room, and it's very impressive. And we did some research with fossils of it or replicas and asked people which they preferred, and etc. But one of the things that and it touches a little bit on Ken's remark on can every object have a story, is you can have only so many stories with people that you can keep people interested. I mean, if you walk through a museum and you have 25 or 100 stories with great objects with great stories, then there's no story. They will not be interested. So how do you decide as a museum? Because for us, it's very logical to do the T-Rex, but I want to have also other objects as well. But how do you decide which objects are worth putting so much story in it that you really want to touch and engage the audiences, and which ones don't you? So that's my question. And thank you for the very, very nice session up to now.
So does anyone want to take this question?
Do you want to start, Ken, or shall I start? No, you're of course absolutely right. And I am a sucker for very proactive restitution and deaccessioning policy. So I'm with you there, Ken. But in general, we are now working for a new permanent exhibition with a dramaturgist, because there's of course an overall narrative that is, and an experience that is very important for going into a museum context and going into a museum exhibition context as well, or even more so. And if you let exhibitions be made by custodians, then you can't see the narrative anymore because of all the objects and all the stories that are on display. So less is more. And my own experience working with this dramaturgist who comes from a theater background is very inspiring, but it will create tension with people from, the classical curator, custodian, and others. But yeah, let's do that fight together.
I would say very briefly, I've been very lucky in working with some really inspired curators over my career. And I suppose my short answer is that is the art of curation. I mean, it's not the only thing that curators do. And, it's almost like, how do writers make a great character, or how do cinema people make a great, I think the training and the inspiration of being a great exhibition curator is sometimes like Basil's finger, I've only seen it on screen. I immediately think that looks like a great object. But other times I think it takes learning and talking and collaboration and somebody at the center of that who's often called a curator to just decide, exactly as Léontine says that, less is more, but let's fix on that. So yeah, curation.
Thank you for Basil.
Just a small remark. I think really to go back to Léontine, it's the tension. We really have to deal it and to work with different people, not only scientists, to work with dramaturgists or with scenographer, and really to find out. And I think normally it's a long process to find out which object is the right object and what's the right story to tell, and not to tell everything. But that's curating, and perhaps sometimes you go the wrong way. Yeah. And sometimes it's easier not to have a T-Rex because with T-Rex, it's the best story.
Yeah, T-Rex can also be boring, or it's a challenge because you cannot fail with it, basically, because it's just as an object so strong. So sometimes you ask yourself, is it the exhibition or is it just the object? Would the people come if you just put it into a plain room? Anyhow, I think we are now just ahead of time, and my colleagues are already waiting in the coffee rooms for you to join them. And I think it's a good time now to take all the questions that are still out there to the coffee rooms. So thank you all, thank you, and hope to see you in the coffee rooms.
Thanks, Linda. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.